Hello and welcome everyone. All right, I see everyone is now in the room. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar called Disaster in Progress on Militarism and Climate Change. My name is Rachel Small and I'm the Canada organizer at World Beyond War, a global movement to abolish war and establish a just and sustainable peace. I'm thrilled to see that we are being joined here tonight by people truly from across Turtle Island and from at least 25 countries further afield. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I myself, as well as my co-host, Richard from Science for Peace, who you'll hear from later, are joining you today from Toronto, which, like many of the cities that people here are joining from, I suspect, is one built on stolen Indigenous land. It's land that is the ancestral territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, stolen land that needs to be given back. For all of us who are joining from so-called Canada, the foundational war of this country is, of course, one of colonization. And frankly, we can't talk about militarism or climate change without talking about the colonial violence, historic and present, that is at the very heart of these problems. That's why it's so important to start by mentioning that, and we'll continue to talk about that. And I would encourage everyone here to think about where you're joining us from here today and who was subject to violence and continues to be subjected to violence in order for that place to be how it is today, what its name is today, etc. We know that the climate crisis is, of course, in large part caused by and being used as an excuse for war making and militarism. This can look like wars fought for oil, wars fought and conflicts intensified because of famine, because of the lack of basic resources that's in part caused by climate change. This can look like the shutting down or violence at militarized borders, even as weapons exports, of course, cross borders effortlessly and often secretly. This can look like the outrageous military greenhouse gas emissions, which in Canada aren't even included in our greenhouse gas targets, or the enormous emissions from the mining of materials to create war machines. This can look like, for example, the Canadian state's current plans to buy 88 new bomber jets and its first unmanned armed drones being justified because of the threats that the climate emergency and climate refugees will supposedly cause. Threats that apparently we need jets that cost billions and whose sole purpose is to drop bombs to address. We know that the military and the war machine is also suppressing climate action, suppressing the resistance movements fighting to build the world we need. For example, in Canada, we can look, for instance, at the ways that militarized colonial violence is pushing forward the ever-expanding tar sands, one of the biggest contributions to the global climate crisis on the planet, period. And also at the ways that those who are taking a stand at the climate front lines, those pipeline blockades, people stopping clear cuts, especially Indigenous people, are being regularly attacked and surveilled by the Canadian military. I've just jumped right into the topic and I could go on, but frankly, despite these and so many connections, militarism and climate crisis are not often discussed in concert. And anti-war and climate justice movements are rarely together in the same space. So that's part of what we hope to address tonight. And we're thrilled that so many have come out tonight to join in on this discussion. Clearly, it's one that is warranted and wanted. We have 4 incredible speakers tonight that I'm going to be honored to introduce. The basic format of tonight is each will be given the floor for 10 minutes, after which we will open it up to questions from the audience. We would invite audience questions to be typed and shared in the chat throughout the whole event. And we also, after all the speakers have spoken, will invite people to use the raised hand function for some questions as well. Before I have the pleasure of introducing the first guest, I want to also say that this event is being live streamed to World Beyond War's Facebook at facebook.com/worldbeyondwar. So if you know of others who might like to watch that, you can share that with them as well during and after this event. And while this event is hosted by World Beyond War and Science for Peace, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsoring organizations, Toronto 350, Climate Fast, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, the Global Sunrise Project, the Climate Pledge Collective, and Music for Climate Justice. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for tonight. Clayton Thomas Mueller is a member of the Treaty 6-based Mathias-Kilome Cree Nation, also known as Puckatawagan, located in northern Manitoba, Canada. Based in Winnipeg, Clayton is a senior campaign specialist with 350.org and is involved in many, many initiatives to support the building of an inclusive global movement for energy and climate justice. To name just a few, he's on the board of the Bioneers and the Wildfire Project. He's been recognized by Yes Magazine as a climate hero, and he's one of 10 international human rights defenders who are featured in the National Canadian Museum for Human Rights. He has campaigned across Canada, Alaska, the lower 48 states, organizing in hundreds of First Nations, Alaska Native and Native American communities to support Indigenous peoples in defending their territories against the encroachment of the fossil fuel industry. Clayton, without further ado, it's my honor to welcome you to join us and speak tonight.
Hey, thanks so much, Rachel. That was a great opening. Hi, everybody. Hello from Winnipeg, Danse, Bonjour, Zonge Benesi Nene, Tishnakas, Canoe Totem. As mentioned, my name's Clayton Thomas Mueller. I'm a Cree man from Puckatawagan Cree Nation. And by the way, Rachel, I got to give you a shout out. You said Puckatawagan perfectly. Yeah, I'm really honored to be here. Jaggy and the other speakers, it's a pretty incredible lineup to be featured in to discuss such an important issue. When we think about climate change, when we think about, like the whole, US election, Biden, right? And like the insane climate like policies that he rolled out in his first week in office. There's some good stuff in there. And but when we think about climate change, often it can be a very daunting thing that can be pretty demoralizing and pretty like neutralizing as far as like putting many of us in situations of apathy. And I think war is the same thing. For me, I was really excited to be invited to share a little bit tonight. And I want to make a couple points, and I'm going to try and sew it all together as best as I can. And I'm really excited about questions. So please post your questions. We'll get to that in a bit after all of these incredible speakers. But I guess the message I want to share with you all tonight is that, I live in Canada. Many of you do. Canada is a settler colonial state, and Canada continues to deal with the violence, its violent like history with Indigenous peoples. There's, I think, 630 plus First Nations in this country, all of which the federal government has a fiduciary and legal obligation to consult with. They have a trust relationship with First Nations. First Nations in this country continue to suffer through abject poverty. And this is directly tied to the fact that, all of those 630 plus First Nations make up less than 1% of Canada's total landmass. And, and many of those First Nations are what are called treaty First Nations. Okay. We have the treaties 1 through 11 here in Canada, a couple of other agreements in Toronto, the Two-Road Wampum Treaty in the Maritimes, the Mi'kmaq have their own treaties as well. And these agreements were what my ancestors negotiated looking forward into the future with a powerful force, a military force that came in and expropriated, colonized basically through military power. But they looked south and they were like, oh, damn, the United States is in an Indian war right now. And these Indians are kicking their ass. we don't want to do that. That's what the British people said. So they went into this process of treaties, negotiation, to discuss how we were going to share the lands and waters and all the resources of this country. Now, a lot of people think about treaties and they think, written words on paper, agreements, signatures, handshakes, voila. But from the native side of things, making treaties, we've been doing it for thousands of years. And it is a very spiritual and intensive process that includes much fasting and sacrifice and ceremonies and offerings into the cosmos. So the intention of when Native people make a treaty with another Native person or another non-Native person, it's deeply rooted right into the core of Mother Earth and right out into the universe. Those agreements that are made are sacred, okay? So even though the Brits and the French came in and they were violent and, they killed all our buffalo and all of our other food sources and herded us like cattle onto reservations, the agreements that Native people made with the settler colonial state of Canada, formerly the Crown of the UK, were sacred, okay? And they carry powerful, powerful energy, more powerful than any guns. And, to this day, y'all know what's up in Canada, like we've had a lot of apologies for residential school and whatnot, but Native people continue to, be represented in the most negative statistics right across the board. And so, for me, I wanted to start there and just say that, like, on the colonizer side, they showed up with bad intention. They had guns, and even in the midst of all of that, we still practice the ceremonies to tie those agreements into the earth, into the universe, and here we are, okay? And so, when we look at like the issue of climate change, we are witnessing already the emergence of the great era of climate wars. We look at the migration of Syria, the war in Syria, in other countries as well. And we're at the precipice of the biggest migration of the human race in our entire history. As climate change escalates and as violent, unpredictable climate weather-related events escalate, as regions of Mother Earth become too hot to live, as coastal regions become inundated by rising sea levels, as small island nations, have to completely evacuate to other countries because of rising sea levels. There is a literally like maybe a billion, maybe 2 billion, maybe 3 or 4 billion, considering how many human beings live on coastal regions. There's a migration that is about to happen, that has already started, and that is anchored in conflict, in war, okay? That is hard to wrap your mind around. And, and when you look at the national discourse here in Canada and the United States and other, G8 economies, Western economies, we're talking about changing light bulbs. We're talking about buying a green vehicle, like a battery powered vehicle. We're talking about, buying a Tesla battery for your house, solar panels. But the fact of the matter is that when we look at Canada and our economic framework and the fact that our economy is fundamentally based on, like, for Canada's current neo-colonial economic system, its capitalist system, to like continue to function, Canada has to challenge Indigenous peoples that they made sacred agreements with and continue to practice this process of dispossessing Indigenous peoples from their lands, urbanizing them, all with the goal of providing backdoor access to massive multinational extractive companies to come in and extract natural resources, whether that's timber, whether that's minerals in the mining sector, whether that's the tar sands and other unconventional fossil fuel resources or conventional fossil fuel resources like oil and gas. Canada has a business model that, for it to be successful, Native people are the main boundary, and our collective God-given inherent rights that are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, Section 35. Section 35 tells Canada, like, this is our Constitution. Section 35 stipulates that Native people's right to hunt, fish, and trap, these are inalienable rights that cannot be interfered by corporations or provincial governments who in this country have jurisdiction, at least in the Western provinces, over natural resources. They cannot interfere with our ability to continue to practice our world and cosmovision. But that is not the case. When you lay a map across this country and, you look at where all the white people live in Canada, they all live within 100 kilometers of the US border, okay? But the rest of the country, and, we're, a lot of you here tonight are from Canada. We're the second biggest landmass country in the world, right? I think Russia's the biggest. We have one of the biggest forests in the world. One of the most critical carbon sinks to fight climate change is to let the boreal forest just be and grow, whether it's First Nations, Inuit, or Métis settlements, if you lay a map of the rest of Canada where white people aren't living, where Native people are living, you'll see that all of Canada's most toxic and messed up industries are adjacent to a Métis settlement, to an Inuit hamlet, to a First Nation. And so when we think about that, when we think about like extractive industries and climate change, and Indigenous peoples in the country of Canada, environmental racism is very much a white and red problem. And that's not to say that we don't have poor white communities, poor communities of color that are dealing with, like, the impacts of industry on their health, on their human rights. But disproportionately, Indigenous peoples are both being impacted by industry that is causing climate change, and they are also impacted by climate change disproportionately because it inhibits our ability to practice our way of life. And who are the culprits, right? There's 97, I think, corporations that represent the majority of the world's emissions. None of you on this call are responsible for climate change. It's these massive corporations. And the biggest polluter of all is the US military and the rest of the global military industrial complex. Like the ongoing war machine, the war profiteering machine is the biggest global greenhouse gangster. And so, Native people in this country have mounted for over a decade, well, actually, for 3 decades, but about a decade ago, it got very visible, and white folks got involved, the environmental movement got involved. They launched a campaign in the province of Alberta, to stop the expansion of the world's largest industrial project in the history of humankind, the tar sands, and its associated pipeline infrastructure. And, I'm a part of that. I've been a campaigner with the tar sands campaign for a long time, supporting Native people on the front line of these big fights against big oil. And, it's very dramatic. Tar sands has moved more earth than the Suez Canal. Many of you probably saw that big boat that blocked it up a while back there the other day. The pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, and the 10 largest earthen dams on the planet, okay? Every day they move enough earth in the tar sands, they rip up the boreal forest, Indigenous lands, Cree, Dene, and Métis lands, enough earth every single day to fill up the Toronto Sky Dome, where the Blue Jays play baseball. Every single day. That's the scale of this thing. You can see this so-called development from outer space. It's so big. It has a network of tailings ponds, 13 tailings ponds that represent a surface area of 287 square kilometers of toxic waste affluent from the process they use to superheat water, burning natural gas, to blast 10% of the bitumen out of 90% sand and clay mixture. And what's left, they put it into these tailings ponds. And these tailings ponds are less than 500 meters from the Athabasca River. And a study showed that they leach 11 just one of the tailings ponds, Suncor tailings ponds number 1, leaches 11 million liters a day into the Athabasca River. And there's 12 others, right? But the one study on this one tailings pond showed, and this river flows north. It flows way up past Fort Chipewyan. It goes into Lake Athabasca. It turns into the Mackenzie River. It goes into Great Bear Lake, Great Slave Lake, all the way up to Tuktoyaktuk, eventually releasing into the Arctic Ocean. If one of these tailings ponds were to burst, it would foul a fourth of the world's freshwater resources. The Mackenzie, riparian system represents a tremendous percentage of the world's remaining freshwater resources. And the reason I bring this up is that, you look at Fort Chipewyan, this little sleepy village, 150 kilometers north of Fort McMurray, which is the oil boom town of Canada. It's the tar sands engine. And ironically, like 75% of the city burnt down in a climate like mega fire a couple of years back. This situation is really intense. Just a couple of years ago, the same technology. There was a mine in northern BC. The tailings pond at that mine, same kind of design as the ones in the tar sands, in an area that is seismically less active than the area that the tar sands is in, burst. And it fouled a critical salmon habitat. It destroyed an intact salmon economy held by the local indigenous people. It's kind of a scary thing, like if we really think about where we're headed with climate change and water security, why would we put a fourth of our freshwater resources in danger just so the United States can have cheap oil for their fossil fueled auto-centered transit economy? And the connection, to war, to the military industrial complex, a lot of people didn't know that, for tar sands to be profitable, it's got to be trading above, I think it's between $30 and $50 a barrel. And, back in the day when Bush and Cheney were running the United States, that Cheney, I tell you, that guy he's an evil, he's like Darth Vader. But, the US model is like create never ending war, create profit, drive the price of oil up. We're running out of conventional oil. So conventionals or unconventional oil like tar sands, Gulf of Mexico, Venezuela, the Aramco tar belt, these are the new sources and they are very expensive to process. And so, a lot of the US like military, like incursion oil producing economies around the planet is a strategy to raise the price of oil, to destabilize, the source of oil for the planet, so that these unconventional sources of oil, fracking included, tri-cherry extractive processes, are profitable. Okay, so they create.
We're almost out of time, Clayton.
Okay,
sorry.
So they create war to drive up the price of oil, to like make these new frontiers of oil in oil's dying days profitable. And at the midst of all of that are indigenous peoples, where these places are being extracted from. And I'll give you a case study and then I'll conclude. Beaver Lake Cree Nation, they're in a huge lawsuit against the Canadian government over the violation of their treaty rights because of tar sands development in their lands. They live beside the Cold Lake bombing region, bombing range. It's part of the Canadian military industrial complex. All the fighter jets of Canada, they practice their war machine bombing there. And Cenovus, a tar sands company, has a in situ operation there that the military was bombing. And there has been a nonstop oil spill coming out of the land because of the bombing and, the in situ extraction process that they have not been able to stop. And when activists like Crystal Lehman and others from Beaver Lake have tried to go into their traditional homelands to inspect and see what the heck is happening, what's polluting their water, it's a military base. So they can't even go in. They have no access. Meanwhile, that's their land. They're a sovereign nation. And then you add the layers of the inability to hunt, fish, and trap because of a rapidly destabilizing climate, the inability to, get out of the oil and gas economy because the Canadian government is only interested in supporting extractive industries. There is a huge dilemma here. And when we look across the world, Indigenous peoples are only 350 million peoples out of 7 billion humans on the planet. But we represent 86% of the languages and cultural diversity on the planet, just in that small amount of people. And the places that we call home are the places that represent 86% of the world's last remaining biologically diverse regions. And so Native people, our culture, our world, and cosmovision, the way we exist in the planet is inextricably linked to the remaining biodiversity of the planet. And so, every time there is displacement, migration, war, conflict, extractive industries, white supremacy, it disproportionately impacts Native people. But as we've seen, we're winning. We've been stopping pipelines. We're stopping the Keystone XL. We stopped the Northern Gateway. We stopped the Energy East pipeline. We're going to stop the Trans Mountain pipeline in BC. We're going to stop Line 3. We're going to get DAPL, the Standing Rock pipeline, shut down. We're not going to lose, Creator's got our back. But the fact of the matter is, though, is that there's a lot of weight on Native people and not a lot of resources. And so, as we weave together this narrative tonight, I encourage you all to learn about the contributions to, stopping war, stopping conflict, the role of the military industrial complex in advancing climate change and disrespecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And, know that we, even in the midst of all of the police state and oppression, continue to we're all headed in the same direction. So yeah, with that, I'll leave it at that. And I look forward to questions at the end of the session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Clayton. What a powerful and sort of broad and then zoomed in look at this issue. How does it look like in this one community? How does it look like on the global scale? Yeah, thank you so much. What a great start. And now I'm so thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Cassia Sequoia Slavner. At 22 years old, she's a 2019 Diana Award holder, a global changemaker with Unison Youth, Global Changemakers, and the We Are Family Foundation. She's an 11 times UN Youth Delegate, the first recipient of the Kim Fu Youth Peace Award, and a multi-award winning Gen Z documentary filmmaker. She's also a seasoned photographer, entrepreneur, and a social justice advocate. The Sunrise Storyteller, highly recommend everyone watch it. That was her first feature-length documentary. She directed, filmed at 16, scripted and edited before she had yet graduated from high school. Right now, so excited about her new project. She's working on a film called 1.5 Degrees of Peace, which is a documentary film to inspire a unified movement for peace and climate justice. How could we not invite her to speak on this at this event on exactly this topic? So welcome, Cassia, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here among my other panelists and with you all today to talk about peace and climate justice. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation to share. So just give me a moment. All right. That is visible to everybody, right? Okay, great. So So I'll share a little bit of my background before I get into the topic of peace and climate justice. So I've been a passionate peace advocate since I was 14 when I first joined the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, also known as VOW, which appealed to me as an organization which has a legacy that is deeply rooted in a feminist perspective for decades. So shortly after joining VOW, I was invited to attend the UN Commission on the Status of Women as a youth delegate. And that was my first time. That was my first time attending, and it was a really transformational experience for me. I met women from communities all around the world who were coming together on a wide range of issues with gender equality at the center of it. And it was there that I realized I could use visual storytelling as an expression of my activism. I realized positive impact storytelling could be a really powerful tool to mobilize change. So this photo represented is just one of the incredible women on the left who I was able to meet at my first UNCSW. In my first film, The Sunrise Storyteller, I documented a diverse variety of issues ranging from education for girls to migration, xenophobia, racism, to peace and forgiveness. And although the stories were different, they all shared the common thread of hope and resilience. As a documentary filmmaker, I believe that the most moving stories are told in a way that don't erase the scale of the issues at hand, but do justice to them by showing the resourcefulness and creativity of people at the grassroots level who are taking action in whatever way they can to overcome the adversity they're faced with.
Sorry, Cassia, there's just a little bit of interference with your microphone. Please just make sure it's not hitting up against anything. Thanks so much.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. Is that a little clearer now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So stories have the power to reshape how we see the world, and we must share these stories mindfully, thinking about how the stories are shared and by who, so that we can present accurate representation and not a co-opted narrative. My new film, 1.5 Degrees of Peace, was born out of the intense anxiety that I feel as a Gen Z watching the climate crisis worsen and understanding the deep threat that it poses to current and future generations. My generation cares about our future, the future of our planet, and the future of generations to come. And a lot of us are feeling scared and overwhelmed by the threats and the current trajectory that we're on, facing multiple existential crises like resource scarcity, global pandemics, and the threat of nuclear war. As somebody who's been actively involved in peace advocacy for almost a decade, I began to notice the links between these two issues and wonder why more youth weren't actively involved in peace advocacy as well, when it seemed almost inseparable from climate change and climate action. Now, more than ever, we need these two movements to come together because 1.8 billion youth around the world are living in developing or conflict-affected areas where climate change is already a threat. 1.5 Degrees of Peace will follow the unfolding journeys of youth in their frontline communities. Sorry, my cat is also apparently a peace activist in her own right, joining us all. So youth in frontline communities who are bridging these two issues through their activism, finding positive, sustainable solutions while challenging systems of oppression. And it's my hope that these stories of courageous action ease our personal and collective anxiety, igniting us to stand together and catalyze a unified intergenerational movement for the survival of our planet and all living beings. From climate activists and experts who I've spoken with, I've learned that the impacts of experiencing climate disasters have resulted in Sorry about that. My cat pulled my, she's got she's trying to disrupt these systems of oppression herself. Sorry, I'm gonna get back to it. Yeah, so from the people that I've spoken with in my communities, in the process of making this documentary, I'm only in the beginning phases. The impacts of experiencing climate disasters have resulted in increased resource scarcity and increased violence in their communities. So we're not going to be able to address the threats, the climate crisis, or the impacts of war and militarism without also considering the disproportionate effects that those issues have on women and girls, specifically in those frontline communities. So according to the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, 1 in 5 women and girls who are refugees or who have been displaced because of natural disasters have experienced sexual violence. And women and girls are often tasked with collecting firewood and water for their families. So as the resources become more scarce, their journeys become longer, and it becomes increasingly difficult to find those with a higher likelihood of the potential of experiencing sexual assault in those places as well. So this is why we need to consider a feminist peace, the work of feminist peace organizations as being really crucial to the peace and climate justice movement, and why we need to look at our policies and decision making through an intersectional lens that takes into account a variety of identities. So climate change also contributes to the conditions which make violent conflict more likely to occur. As Clayton previously touched on, before its civil war in Syria, the country experienced one of its worst droughts in over 500 years, according to climate scientists at NASA. And this caused 75% of the country's farms to fail. So climate change alone is not the only contributor to increased violence and conflict. And we've talked about this, Rachel touched on it, Clayton touched on it. The military-industrial complex is also a major culprit of the climate crisis. So countries with large military might, like the US, are some of the greatest industrial polluters with huge carbon footprints. The US military alone emitted 59 million tons of CO2 in 2017, which was bigger than countries, as you can see, like Morocco, Peru, and Sweden. And the US Department of Defense also is one of the largest institutional consumers of petroleum in the world, using up to 100 million barrels of oil per year. So of course, these are only some of the intersectional sections between peace and climate that we need to address. There are many more connections, which I will highlight in 1.5 Degrees of Peace, because if we leave out these critical intersections, then we can't address the needs of the most marginalized among us, and we'll fail to dismantle the systems that are destroying our communities all around the world. So climate and peace activists alike are confronting those main contributors to these crises, like large corporations, extractive industries, and and the governments that support them. Unifying the peace and climate movements as soon as possible is critical, because it's the only way we'll come close to knowing true peace and healing our beloved Earth. Are looking for their leaders to meaningfully include them in decision-making spaces. We want divestment from industries that contribute to inequality and the destruction of our planet. We want investment in clean, sustainable industries and economies. We want demilitarization. We want the abolition of war. We want our basic human rights met and the rights of nature honored. We want peace and climate justice. After speaking with many youth who have experienced the climate crisis and conflict firsthand, you might think that these young people have no hope, because these issues are ginormous in scale and sometimes seem almost impossible to solve. But the youth have hope because we know that if we show up, make our voices heard, and dream up the world that we want to see, we can make a real impact. Everybody deserves to live their fullest potential and experience joy, justice, and equity. We want people to be free of suffering, and that includes having healthy and safe environments and living in harmony with Mother Earth. In order to do this, we need to unite the peace and climate justice activists so we can begin achieving the vision of a world we want to live in now and leave for future generations. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to share my work here. So I will stop sharing my screen. And there we go.
Thank you so much, Cassia. And I'm seeing lots of questions in the comments. I'm so excited for when we will get to share some questions with each of these speakers. But yeah, thank you, Cassia. I was so struck by your list of what we want, which on some level is such modest asks for what we want. And on the other hand, are such radical asks in the world that we have now, asking for people to, I mean, yeah, really be able to continue to live in safety and with the resources they need and with dignity on a planet that keeps existing. Like how little and also how much is that right now with where we are. So thank you so much. Next, I'm thrilled to introduce Jaggi Singh, an independent journalist who writes and produces for No Borders Media and a community organizer based in Montreal. He has been very involved in anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, anti-colonial organizing and projects for 2 decades, including against poverty, war, police violence, racism, and fascism, in support of Indigenous land defenders and undocumented migrants. Jaggi has helped organize so many grassroots mobilizations against capitalism and environmental destruction, including APAC in Vancouver back in '97, the FTAA in Quebec City, which I think was exactly 20 years ago, basically to the day, mobilizations in Montebello, the G8G20 in Toronto, name it, he's been there, he's been such a big part of it, and he has helped to launch and sustain projects and groups like the Anti-Capitalist Convergence, the Montreal Anarchist Book Fair, No One is Illegal, Solidarity Across Borders, Justice for Victims of Police Killings, and many others. What a gift to our movements. Jaggi, thrilled to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, World Beyond War and Science for Peace, and all the people working behind the scenes. I want to thank especially Rachel, who I've been liaising with and who I respect immensely as an organizer and activist. I'm honored to be sharing this panel with Cassia, Elle, and Clayton, and I appreciate everyone who's taking the time to listen and contribute to this discussion. I'm speaking to you from Montreal. The island of Montreal is known as Tiohtià:ke in the language of the Ganeyaga. The Ganeyaga are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. But beyond that acknowledgement, I want to say that Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination directly or indirectly are crucial to understanding climate change and militarism. So I just don't want to acknowledge these lands, but also highlight the frontline resistance of Indigenous peoples to colonial capitalism all over the Canadian state. I think these are some of the best pathways of understanding resistance and ways forward. There's the Inuit resistance to mine expansion on Baffin Island, the assertion of Mi'kmaq self-determination over the lobster fishery, the Anishinaabe who are enforcing a moratorium on the moose hunt near Parc La Vérendrye in Quebec, the Cree Nation, which is resisting uranium exploration on EU Ishi, opposition to land and housing development at 1492 Landback Lane at Six Nations, the ongoing struggle at Grassy Narrows against clear-cut logging and mercury poisoning, the Wet'suwet'en resistance to the Coastal GasLink pipeline, the resistance to the Trans Mountain pipeline by resistors on unceded Secwépemc lands, Indigenous urban-based organizing, resistance, harm reduction, survival work in all the major cities of the Canadian state. I can honestly use all my time naming these sites as struggles, but I won't. But all of these movements are ultimately threatened by paramilitary police and, when necessary, full-on military violence, as we saw during the Mohawk resistance at Oka in 1990. Canada's militarism is inherently inward and brutal. And like policing in Canada, it's rooted in control of disobedient Indigenous populations. I've named some struggles, but there are people behind those struggles, and I can acknowledge many of them. Many names come to mind: Kanahos Manuel, Shannon Chief, Judy De Silva. But due to the subject, I want to acknowledge and highlight one in particular, and that's Elizabeth Panashwe. She's an Innu from Labrador. In addition to opposition to resource extraction, a destructive dam, her patient and tireless work on cultural revival, Elizabeth opposed the low-level NATO flights in Nitisinaan during the 1980s and 90s. Those flights, of course, being another iteration of militarism here in the Canadian state. I want to highlight that these struggles are foundational to social justice in the Canadian state and elsewhere, and I can't understate their importance. For non-Indigenous peoples on these lands, it demands active complicity. They open up pathways to understanding struggle and resistance and towards collective liberation. I'm going to use the rest of my time to make a few other points that I hope will be useful to the discussion at hand and complement what Cassia and Clayton have contributed and what Elle will be contributing. The first is, of course, understanding the dynamics of power and the structures of power. There needs to be clarity about the power structure that we're up against. We need to name them. We need to take names and addresses and pay visits when necessary. And I won't keep you in suspense, but those systems of power are include most notably colonialism and capitalism, an entire political, bureaucratic, and corporate class that's in its service. The very basis of militarism is this colonial capitalist system and the decisions made by political corporate, by the politicians and corporations. The very basis of the climate crisis we're in is this colonial capitalist system and the decisions made and enforced by generations of politicians and corporations. These things just didn't happen. They're structures of power. So we need to target those systems of power for our opposition and for our resistance, and most importantly, not for accommodation. Unfortunately, various processes like nationalisms, a focus on lifestyle choices, this is all exacerbated by tabloid media, its equivalent on social media, and the rise of the far right. They tend to distract us from those actual systems of power that have names and that we can oppose. We see this distraction kind of play out, for example, right now in the pandemic, where instead of focusing on how governments and corporations can structurally do what needs to be done to keep us safe, such as taxing rich people and making major investments, instead we focus on blaming other people laterally, other neighbors, snitching on other people. Within the green or climate change movement, the same dynamic plays out, where instead of focusing on systems of power, we focus on other people's lifestyle choices. This plays out when we look at poverty, where poverty is seen as some sort of personality failure, or someone else is stealing jobs or going on welfare. We're punching down. We're laterally blaming other people instead of punching up. So we really need to stress that as we look at solutions. We also need to reject this tripartite idea that we live in, especially here in the Canadian state. By tripartite, I mean this idea that there's government, there's corporations, and there's NGOs, and that there's some sort of negotiation between the three. And that we should, if you believe in social justice, sort of expand the scope of NGOs. This is a false model. It's a failed model. What we're in is a struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed. And we need to have clarity about that. And it's so refreshing when social movements have that clarity. For me, that clarity really came, it was a process, but it really came with a bang in 1994, on New Year's Day, 1994, when the Zapatistas in southern Mexico announced their struggle to the world. And they declared NAFTA not as something to negotiate with, not as something to have social clauses in, but as a death sentence. So I want to provide a perspective here and emphasize a perspective that pushes the boundaries of policy and lobbying, because those perspectives get into this logic of accepting the fundamental basis of Canadian colonial capitalism. That is, accepting the fundamental basis of what has created this crisis despite best intentions. One element of that process is, of course, Canada itself. And we need to demystify Canada itself. And knowing that there's international audience, some of the dynamics I'm speaking about within Canada would apply to countries like Sweden or Norway or Denmark or Australia or New Zealand, places that are portrayed as soft powers, benevolent, honest brokers, so-called peacekeepers. Here, we perpetuate this idea of the good Canadian or the good Canadian myth. And that needs to be broken down. And already both Clayton and Cassia in different ways have done so. And it's easy enough to break down, we didn't join the murderous war in Iraqis back in 2003, but we provided the bullets and the arms so that others could do that destruction. We were in Afghanistan for a large part of that brutal occupation. We are complicit in wars and occupations worldwide. We're arms exporters. We participate in wars. But it's not just about armies and generals, but the generalized violence of colonial capitalism. That misery that we as Canadians, I'm speaking to those of us within the Canadian state, that violence of colonial capitalism is projected out from Toronto, from Calgary, from Vancouver, from Montreal, from those skyscrapers, or now people's Zoom calls or what have you. That's projected through those resource companies, mining companies, resource extraction companies who are projecting that throughout the world. And Clayton outlined a lot of the environmental devastation that's perpetuated by that violence, tailing spills, this model of the tar sands that's exported elsewhere. But I want to stress it's not just that environmental devastation and the violence that goes along with it, which includes the violence of security companies, paramilitaries, and now armies. It's also the framework of violence that's created, where people are disposable, where they know they're going to face violence if they resist. That in and of itself creates a context of violence, and that is projected out by us. Historically, it's done so. We've done so, for example, in Indonesia. I mean, I can just name country after country where we've been on the bad side. We've had this neo-colonial relationship with Haiti. One excellent example is Brazil. I'm not sure people are familiar with a company called Brookfield Asset Management. It's a multi-billion, trillion-dollar company based in Toronto. It used to be called Brascan, which is based in Brazil. It's been around for over 100 years. It's at the roots of Canadian colonial capitalism that projects itself out, that mines, that bolsters governments such as the neo-fascist Bolsonaro government in Brazil, throughout Africa, throughout Latin America and Southeast Asia and the Middle East and in the Arctic now. This is the colonial capitalism that the Canadian state projects out that we are directly responsible for. It's neoliberalism, it's those trade agreements, it's those investor protection mechanisms put into bilateral agreements and free trade agreements. These are extraordinarily violent institutions and structures. We're in the middle of it, and it's not just expressed in terms of the climate crisis or militarism. So we can't dilute or ignore this understanding, and we need to be aware of the co-optation dynamics that goes along with this. Nightmares are nightmares, and they're still nightmares, even if they're just a little bit greener and they're a little bit more peaceful. This isn't about having armies that can claim to be greener and more multicultural. It's not about having green and bike-friendly neighborhoods that are for the rich and the super rich, while violence is invisible and therefore not talked about. We don't want to have larger cages where unjust and brutal systems of power continue to exist. So let me talk a bit more about resistance. I feel like the only authentic strategies come from the nitty-gritty of resistance. And when I talk about resistance, I want to highlight, like I've already done, Indigenous frontline struggles, but Black Lives Matter, anti-poverty struggles, struggles for workers' rights, farmer struggles, harm reduction work, police and prison abolition struggles, migrant justice, support with marginalized populations, queer and trans struggles, anti-racism, and yes, anti-fascism. And I say anti-fascism because worldwide, from India to Brazil to Hungary to France to the United States, that ideology of seeking scapegoats within marginalized populations is alive and well. And we should have no illusions. They will and they have co-opted green politics in advancing their mission. So I mention these struggles because I'm really skeptical of making what we're up against reductive. One dynamic that we see in both struggles against the climate crisis and against militarism is the expression of that opposition in apocalyptic terms. Within the climate crisis, it's all going to hell, we're all going to die. This is the struggle. This is the one we should focus on. Many of you here will remember how that expressed itself within the anti-militarism movement in terms of nuclear Armageddon. And it's true, these are serious struggles, but we can't reduce it to that because honestly, the nightmare is here and has already been here for so many marginalized populations. The prison industrial complex in the United States, which is essentially a continuation of Jim Crow, is a nightmare for marginalized Black populations. That's already here. The unprecedented migration around the world before the acknowledgement of the climate crisis has created an entire disposable population that's living a life of misery, that is risking drowning on the high seas, that is in the hands of people that exploit them. That includes not just coyotes or smugglers that mean ill, but that also includes governments that exploit that labor. That nightmare expresses itself within super exploited labor worldwide. So we need to really be careful about speaking in those reductive apocalyptic terms, because the question is apocalypse for who? And when CEOs and certain politicians are co-opting this work, both in terms of so-called peace and in terms of climate change, we need to be highly skeptical. I assert that every expression of organized resistance to colonial capitalism, whether in the neighborhood against police violence or in state capitals against policymakers, is valid and needs to be valued as such. And all of those movements that I've named and more that I've neglected to name, and I apologize if that I have, all of those movements open up perspectives about how we can move forward in a liberatory way. We need a convergence of struggles and not reduced struggles. We need a convergence of struggles and not isolated turf and silos. And I would add, especially knowing the audience today, that these struggles need to be internationalized. We need to reinvigorate what was an important component of the political left, and that's internationalism. I'm coming to the end of my time, so I just want to stress in conclusion the essential importance, especially for those of us here in the Canadian state, of Indigenous resistance and our active support for it in its diverse forms, which also includes the militant forms of resistance. That demands our complicity, and we need to express that resistance in terms of opposition to colonialism and capitalism. And the climate emergency and militarism are linked to various and diverse struggles, internationalized struggles. So we need to find ways to converge them and to not reduce them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaggi. I mean, there's so much I could thank you. You packed a lot of information into just a few minutes, and it's so valuable. I think one thing that stood out for me is the ways that you highlighted that it's not just that we don't happen to be in conversation with each other, that we're pitted against each other, that under capitalism, under the idea of a scarce resources, like we're made to fight with each other instead of getting outside of that mindset and building the types of visionary movements that are for everyone now that you're talking about. Yeah, thank you so much. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker and poet, Elle Jones. Elle is a spoken word poet, an educator, a journalist, and a community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax, recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work, and especially her work in prison justice. She's a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people. Highly recommend listening to it. She was the 50th Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Her book of spoken word poetry is called Live from the African Resistance. She also writes a weekly column for the Halifax Examiner and was an Atlantic Journalism Award winner in 2018. She'd like to pay tribute to the many nameless and unrecognized women whose work makes it possible for her to be here today. Thank you so much for being here today, Elle, and we're so thrilled to hear your words and your poetry tonight. Sorry, we can't hear you yet, Elle.
Rookie mistake. I said, thank you for having me. And I'm going to try and go fast because I want to squeeze in poems. They say it isn't a crisis because we haven't burned up yet. Planet's getting hotter, but no reason for you to sweat. Bumblebees are under an extinction threat, but money's sweeter than honey, so don't you get upset. The CEOs are off buying up another private jet. There's a hefty year-end bonus for the oil execs. Trudeau bought out the pipelines and all the rich invest. The clock's ticking down to zero, but there's dollars in the chest. When they find the corporate polluters, it barely makes a dent. No charges for CEOs, but they charge the fishermen. Go check out Pictou Landing and just absorb the stench. When they get scientific reports, they just bury the contents. And it seems like there's a cover-up across the continent. Follow the money in politics. They fund the president. And whoever's in the White House, corporations pay the rent. And that's why we funnel weapons to the Saudi government. So they say that land defenders are illegal protests. The grandmothers by the river are facing down arrest. And there isn't a court in town to prosecute the resource theft, while conservative politicians suck up to the yellow vests. Standing Rock and Unistoten, we never can forget. RCMP breaking through the gates and tearing down the tents. They've put the leaders into cages because they said that they're a threat, while the courts hand out injunctions to protect the 1%. The rest of us can go away and stand behind the fence. Indigenous nations telling them that they don't have consent, but they bulldoze all the treaties and the law is always bent until the polar bears are drowning because all the glaciers melt. And the poor people are drowning, the first to be oppressed. Indigenous and Black communities where all their trash is left. There's landfills, tar pits, sewage plants beside most of the rest. They don't admit the rates of cancer that send us to our deaths. Well, the pipelines keep on running in the east and in the west. They've blasted through the sacred mountains and they scraped the ocean's depths. Oil spills across the surface for miles and miles they stretch, and they say that larger than Texas is the Pacific trash vortex. And maybe Garbage Islands is where they'll relocate us next. Canadian mines poison the Amazon and people dispossessed. They've buried all the bodies deep where light is never met. So the only place you find the headlines is on the internet, because the media gets their money from the same place politicians get. Bought and paid for, bought and paid for. So the narrative is set. And don't trust the universities because they won't divest. Wasn't Peter Mansbridge speaking to petroleum interests? Aren't our shiny buildings from the money they invest? Don't they call security whenever we dissent? Don't they profit from the military-industrial complex? In the shadow of oil money, aren't we all just silhouettes? And there's another war for oil that's running up the debt. Another bomb lands on a hospital or on a minaret. There's refugees along the border. Another headline frets, and Coke done stole the water while the cholera infects. Monsanto panded the seeds, even such a tiny speck. The farmers light themselves on fire or they're hanging by the neck. But who cares about their life if someone gets a bigger check? If they could privatize the sun, they charge us when the rays descend. But it still snows in winter, so they say the climate's doing well. They say it's just a blip, all these extreme weather events. Wildfires rage in California, pull the prisoners from their cells. After all, if you want to make a money omelet, you got to break a couple eggs. In the typhoons and the hurricanes, we might break a couple legs. And when the floodwaters rise, we might need a couple shelter beds. But if you think there's climate change, well, then you shouldn't hurt your head. Just keep filling up the tank until we go into the red. Just keep filling up the ballot box with votes against yourself. The kids are walking out of classes trying to clean up adult mess. There's wildlife choking on the garbage and strangling in the nets. There's more roadkill on the highway every day as suburbs manifest. And we'll all one day be roadkill if the crisis ain't addressed. We'll all drink the poison water when the chemicals ingest. And once we've destroyed the planet, there's nowhere else to rent. When we've destroyed ourselves, there'll be no more time to spend. And so there's no more time to lend if we don't want this world to end. There's time to make a change if we want this world to mend. Will it take until our grandchildren for us to have regrets? We have to want a world beyond some cash and private jets, because racism and poverty and war all intersect. When all of us are suffering for someone else's wealth, but there's still so few of them, and we have all the strength. We may think they have the power, but power always bends, and there's power in our breath, and there's power in our steps. There's power in the breadth of nature and in the ocean's depths, and they will not steal our futures, not by handshakes, deals, or stealth. It is their time that is coming, because their power always ends. Thank you. I'm just going to keep moving quickly. This one's my tribute to the Biden government. A woman's going to send the drones, so ready the covers of your Vogues. The food bank lines are now miles long, but a woman's the one who sends the bombs. Liberal feminism can't be wrong when a woman's the one who sends the bombs. Can't get workers PPE, but you go, girl Nancy Pelosi. All hail the bipartisan war parties. Now Trump is gone, we all agree. George W. Bush has been redeemed. The war criminals are on our team. And there's a black woman on my TV screen. And when she bombs, I'll yell, slay, queen. We'll force your countries to be free, and little black girls can finally see themselves in drones and F-16s. And this is MLK Jr.'s dream, brought to you by Wall Street, brought to you by the elites. We'll never ever give you peace, fund military and police, but a woman could be commander-in-chief. See what can happen when you believe? The resistance heroes, hip, hip, hooray, the FBI and CIA, the generals and NSA, so please enjoy your new air base. We've all forgot Abu Ghraib, we all forgot Guantanamo Bay, and none of them will see the Hague. The Patriots Act so yesterday. We're all in love with John McCain, made Lockheed Martin great again. Central neoliberals, all the rage, kids still living in a cage. The war party is here to stay, and let's lock Julian Assange away. We can't let him expose the truth. We're never bringing home the troops. Obama's so cool shooting hoops. You'll all be crushed under the boot. We're plotting out another coup. Billionaires we won't prosecute. We save that for moms of truant youth. Those Timberlands were looking cute. So let the oil companies pollute. Hell, put them in the cabinet. Add bankers to make up the set. We'll regulate the internet. Corporate news is all you'll get, but a woman's going to send the jets. Are you many women happy yet? This moment gives me all the feels. A woman's making weapons deals. A woman's making refugees. A woman's going to rob and steal. Last week, we were environmentalists, but now wars for oil are feminist. And history will reminisce how all the donors benefit. Orange man is out the door. Things can go back to how they were before. Biden voted for the Iraq war. How dare you ask for any more? Your kid's still super predators and his kid's on strike number 4, but prison's just for you and yours. And really the crime bill's all your fault. This is the time for unity. Bow down to oil and energy. And let's be friends with GOP and white suburban families. There's no more white supremacy. Black woman deliver us the vote, we'll still be kneeling on your throat. But a woman's going to send the drone, so volunteer to work those phones so we can bomb some woman's home and probably waterboard her son. They're back in fashion, neocons. So 4 more years of settlements, war parties are in agreements, and let's hashtag Black excellence. Kamala is vice president. The ladies join the gentlemen in sword, famine, wild beast pestilence, the 4-horse persons of apocalypse. These days we call that feminist. Is this the dream of suffragettes? I heard her bombs never miss. And don't forget to call her Ms. Madame, her honor, she or ma'am. Get ready those detainment camps. Muster the troops, line up the ranks. A woman's going to send the tanks. And all of us will give her thanks, especially weapons manufacturers, banks. And thanks to those suburban moms, a woman's going to send the bombs. I'm glad a woman is so strong to send our countries all those bombs. I'm going to do one more very quickly. I'm going to cut the last verse so that I'm not taking too much time. This one has a refrain. Feel free to say it. It's obvious. It's not one more drop. I'm going to do it very quickly. They say there's one rule for the few and another for the many. Trillions of dollars for the banks and the poor get not a penny. And they've convinced us all that the crumbs they give are plenty, and that's why people in Alberta elected Jason Kenney. Well, that and that they always have some brown folk as the enemy. When Indigenous people block the pipelines, they send the military and there's lead all in the water, but is water necessary? You can't even afford the plot in your family cemetery, but just blame the immigrants in the media commentary. They've got white folk marching to save the job of millionaire Don Cherry. And whether we wear poppies got the white folk in a frenzy. And in the Toronto mayoral election, the 3rd place was a Nazi. They voted in Doug Ford because his brothers seem so friendly. They'll sell you dollar beers while your pension fund stays empty. Don't have any savings while your banker drives a Bentley, and they hold up billionaires as the people we should envy. Children in this country can't put breakfast in their belly. People on assistance can't even pay to ride the ferry. They make billions off the weapons you use against your menis, but if you possess a gun, well, then the courts will give you 20. But when corporations violate, the government won't condemn them because there's one law for the people, but for the rich, the laws are bendy. And you end your life in debt and the burden is too heavy, so your kids go off to foreign countries where they end up buried. So to the killers at the top, not one more drop. Generals, guards, and cops, not one more drop. And they plunder, steal, and rob, and they strip us of our jobs, but we will not join their mobs. Not one more drop, not one more drop of poor and working class blood for their capitalistic wars. So they send the working class to die in wars we can't find in the atlas. Military surplus goes to cops who use Black men as target practice. They keep the oil wells running, guarded by private military contractors, while the sanctions they impose killed millions of Iraqis. In their Black site prisons, locals tortured by their captors. But then they say terrorism was caused by other factors. Military budget keeps exploding like a nuclear reactor, while the livelihood of ordinary people broke it into fractures. They'll offer luxury condos to the Toronto Raptors, while the homeless on the street can't even find a benefactor. When WikiLeaks showed their war crimes, they imprisoned all the hackers and they fire all the athletes who tell us Black Lives Matter. But the war machine keeps rolling like wheat into a tractor. Hollywood propaganda, we've got snipers played by actors, and they tell us hope and change came with President Obama, so the people vote again for their neoliberal masters. Don't even watch the news, it's all corporate paid chatter, all designed for you to serve your children on a platter. Slavery is a choice, says another foolish rapper, and now Amazon's invested, so your doorbell is a tracker. Well, the workers are on food stamps and death row is getting blacker. Preaching prosperity gospel so you're brainwashed by your pastor. Corporations making money after every environmental disaster. They sent UN troops to Haiti and spread cholera in the water. And so there's endless blood and endless blood that splatters. Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, it's all another chapter. And there's always some brown person that they'll say is the attacker, and every politician paid by corporate backers. So to the killers at the top, not one more drop. Generals, guards, and cops, not one more drop. And they plunder, steal, and rob. So they strip us of our jobs, but we will not join their mob. Not one more drop, not one more drop of poor and working class blood for their capitalistic wars. Not one more drop of Black and working class blood for their imperialistic wars. Thank you, everybody.
Not one more drop. Thank you, Al. I watched people's jaws drop, and just what a powerful way to close out this section of the event, truly linking together, I think, every struggle and every issue that everyone else raised on this, plus some more. And also, I know your poem was to Biden, but right now, I feel like half of my job is debunking the idea that we have a feminist prime minister and that he's just launched a feminist foreign policy, and that is the antidote that we need. I saw some people in the chat saying this is the inauguration speech that we need. So thank you so, so much. I'm seeing people ask where they can get your poetry. We are going to send a follow-up. I know we'll drop some links in the chat, but also we are going to send a follow-up email to all of you with the recording of this and with those kinds of links. I know Clayton shared a video link as well. We'll share the link to Bayel's book, etc. Because there's so much here to follow up on. Reminder, now is the time to write some questions in the chat if you haven't written your questions in already. And I'll give just another second for them to be compiled before I hand it over to Richard. One thing I want to mention that connects a lot of these issues is that there's one particular struggle that World Beyond War just sort of launched a support campaign around, which is supporting the indigenous people of Tambrau and West Papua, who are right now fighting to stop the government of Indonesia from building a military base without permission on their land. The reason it feels so connected to everything we're talking about now is that the purpose of this military base turns out to be, this is not official, but this is what we know, to protect the corporate interests of mining companies, many of which are likely to be Canadian mining companies. So every time you dig a little bit into why is there a military base here, what is this military project about, you stumble onto all these other issues that we're talking about tonight. I'll drop the link in the chat for just that campaign and how you can support if you're interested. Now it's my pleasure to hand the stage over to my co-host, Richard Sandberg of Science for Peace, to lead us in the next part of this event and to hear from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Well, Elle's act is one that's very hard to follow. And in fact, in listening to her poetry, I've forgotten everything I was going to say. But in any event, my role is pretty simple here. I'm supposed to moderate the remaining oh, sorry, I haven't got my light on, just a minute. Okay, that's somewhat better. My job is to moderate the remaining two segments of this program, the first being the Q&A and the second being what I would call action planning. So turning first to the Q&A, I note that for those of our colleagues online from the UK, Ireland, Germany, and the Netherlands, it's already 1:15. It's very late for you. So we're not going to keep you very much past 1:30 your time or 8:30 our time. So we'll only have about a quarter of an hour for the Q&A. And just to remind you again that if you haven't put your questions into the chat, then do use the Zoom facility of raising hand in order for Greta Zaro to recognize you. So please ask your questions very briefly, and also mention who you want to respond to your question on our panel. So I'll now turn it over to Greta to actually work through the questions.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so you can use the raise hand feature, click the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen and then click raise hand. If you're dialing in with your telephone, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and then we'll also take the questions from the chat. So I'll start with some of those that have come in already. The first question, which is kind of the common one that always comes to mind in these discussions, is why do you think so many climate change campaigners ignore the impact of militarism? We've been in so many spaces with environmental groups that are just not talking about the issues that we're addressing tonight and the interconnections. So this could be to anyone if you want to respond, any of the panelists. How can we bring this up with environmental organizations, and why is there this disconnect? Anyone who wants to respond, you can just unmute yourself and respond.
I'm hoping to hear from Clayton or Cassia.
Hey folks, sorry, I'm at the COVID shot place right now. I'm getting my COVID shot and I missed that last question because they need my health card and I was calling my son to get it. What was the question?
Yeah, briefly, the question was just why do so many climate change campaigners ignore the impact of militarism, and how can we sort of get environmental organizations to talk about militarism?
Well, I think we live in an era, there's a new thing with the triple threat of global pandemic, of climate change, and of, you know, economic recession at a scale that we have never seen. I think we have an opportunity right now for the emergence of exactly what Jaggi was describing, intersectional approaches to trying to solve global, you know, catastrophes at a local level, to democratize, you know, the way we organize, you know, to show up as Jedis, you know, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, to like have an anti-colonial analysis.
I need to you go in the informed
Oh,
consent area. Is
which
that
one?
right? That the informed consent area
Okay.
is
Thanks, Clayton. Kasia or others, did you want to respond?
I guess so. I've been speaking to a lot of young people in the climate movement, and maybe this seems a little bit simplistic to say, but I think a lot of young people in the climate space simply don't know about connections. Peace is sometimes an intangible issue. Like, what does peace really look like? What are the threats that are kind of causing a lack of peace? It's sometimes, I think, for young people, the issue seems like something that only gets discussed in boardrooms with people who are experts on nuclear disarmament or who have access to like those decision-making spaces, when we can really break down the similar interlinking causes of, you know, both the military-industrial complex or, you know, climate injustices. They share a lot of the same kind of overlapping causes, and so I think that, you know, a lot of young people can't change what they don't know yet, and we have to invite people into conversations about how we can bring the two issues together, that intersectionality. So that is what I would say.
Okay, great. Let's move on to another question. We have a raised hand from a 413 number. You can now unmute. You can press *6 to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. This is Deborah Andrew. I live in Shelburne, Massachusetts. And thank you to everyone who's spoken. It's been very powerful and very inspiring to see so many who understand the military contribution, the enormous military contribution to the harm on the earth. I believe also, sadly though, that there is a great belief in what's called clean energy. And unfortunately, there's great evidence that neither solar panels nor industrial wind turbines are benign or sustainable solutions. And with your permission, Greta, I would like to send some concrete information and some suggested readings to those who've been on the program tonight.
Yeah, please send them over email to us afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I do wonder if I can build on your question. That's a little bold of me, but I think there is an issue of sort of false solutions to the climate crisis. And there are a lot of technological solutions that are being put out. And I think that it can be a hard thing to counter. And I'm curious if any of our guests today might want to answer that aspect of the question.
Thank you.
Well, the idea that we'll be saved by technology is, is another element of distracting us from those power structures, and it actually puts a lot in the hands of those people, right? So you, instead of focusing on the Elizabeth Panashues and the Judy De Silvas of the world who are on the front lines of resistance, we talk about Elon Musk and Bill Gates. And so that's the problem that I see there. Who controls technology has a lot to say, has everything to say about how it will be used. And so it's part of that. It's a more, I guess, subtle way of distracting us from the issue at hand, which is that struggle between oppressed and oppressor, and where those solutions come from. So that would be a quick answer that I would give to that. Oh, and I wanted to add to I forget the person's name. I remember their town, Shelburne, Massachusetts. But I just wanted to add to that. I'm speaking to you from Quebec, and hydropower is put forward as this great solution as well, because it's a cleaner energy. And I just encourage, in the spirit of what I was saying before, for people to talk to Innu or Atikamekw, and the Cree as well, where the hydro lines come from. But there's a lot to say about how destructive that is as well. And there's been a lot of resentment that I've heard expressed by people from those communities where fossil fuels are demonized and yet hydro in Quebec isn't. And obviously, you know, on one level, fossil fuels are, I guess, scientifically worse, but on another level, it just again completely ignores who's being dispossessed and for what reason. And a world of hydro dams without analyzing that power structure means more misery for the people who've been experiencing that misery for generations and generations.
Great, thank you, Jaggy. And actually, we'll just keep you on the mic because we have another question for you here, which anyone else can respond to as well. But someone in the chat asks, right now, a lot of far-right, racist, anti-immigrant people are currently climate deniers. What can we do to plan for and prevent the rise of eco-fascist ideas when they realize the climate crisis is real? How can we get ahead of this and pre-counter the fear-mongering that they might use on climate migrants, such as been used for refugees from the Middle East or Africa or Latin America?
Well, the far right, I mean, the far right has a lot of different elements, but a good chunk of it has co-opted and talks in green language, sometimes in horrible ways. I even hate mentioning this, but you know, I hate mentioning it, but the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter talks about that, you know, and they talk about green politics and having lower populations, and it's eco-fascism as the person mentioned, and it just to me to me reiterates the importance of the centrality of anti-fascism. There's a button I wear on my bag. It's like, you know, if you're not an anti-fascist, what are you then? And often anti-fascism is perceived, and the far right and, you know, tabloid media has done a good job on trying to demonize what anti-fascism is, but I'm talking about an everyday anti-fascism. You know, this is an ideology that seeks to scapegoat people and eliminate many of them. And it will borrow from whatever movement it needs to, whether it's socialism, green politics, or whatever to achieve that. So yeah, there's some climate deniers in that movement, but many of them who are the more thinker part of that movement have co-opted. So it to me emphasizes the centrality of anti-fascism. We can't ignore that anymore. When you have the possibility of Marine Le Pen making she's going to make the second round of the French election next year, and she's going to get 45%, which means she's within range of becoming the next president of France. Not that Macron's any better, but when we already had Trump, the normalization of this politic is horrible. And what it does to both the anti-militarism movement and the climate change movement is to not talk about how it's been normalized to talk about not having fewer immigrants. It's been normalized to talk about closing down borders. And we've lost sight of the liberatory models of what we want, which is, you know, prison abolition, police abolition, open borders. So there's a lot more to say, but the centrality of anti-fascism to all our movements, everyday anti-fascism, is crucial. Not providing a platform to these people, opposing them, and clearly, and this is a very multi-generational audience, clearly there's a lot to learn from people who've lived through actually fighting that and what happens when you don't deal with it in its early stages. And we are at a moment where we need to deal with that in a very real way.
Great, thanks. Let's go to some of the raised hands.
May I say that we only really have time for one more question and answer? It's already 25 after 8.
Okay, well, we'll go to one more raised hand then. Lowell, you can now unmute.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I am going to lower my hands too. Yeah, I'm an architect in Toronto. I guess sole proprietor for about 17 years. I guess, yeah, it took me a long time to realize that, you know, we've been building monster homes in all our suburbs, fiberglass filled, with an airspace that has brick veneer, which means has holes so that the water can get out because the brick is so thin when it gets wet. And with the nuclear and Pickering plant closing, I can think that there's going to be a possible serious crisis, because I mean, it only takes, you know, an extreme climate event now, right, to and I've never gone without power in my lifetime, 40 years in Toronto. And it's the fact that we have, basically disregarded the fact that we have a cold climate. And we would appropriate glass towers, from the States, right? In a cold climate where it needs air conditioning in the summertime and there's no insulation. And we would build condos like this up until recently. That has no insulation value. Now I can't remember my final point. I'm sorry. The possibility of going out of power in our cold climate. I think it's time that we cannot appropriate technology from other places in the world that is much more mild climate. Thank you. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
I think some of what I heard in your question was that we're often talking about sort of resource extraction and other mega projects that are happening in other places, and we're often not looking at cities in the same way. And I'm curious, I would be really curious to hear what some of our guests think on that, and especially like Elle's very city-based organizing in Halifax. I'd be curious to hear.
What I'm thinking about is Ting Chak's book Undocumented, which I know many people have read, which really looks at the role of planning and oppression, right? So that we tend to think of space as neutral, as things like we just have buildings and we just live with them without thinking about like the politicizing of that space. So in Undocumented, Ting Chak is looking at like somebody built immigration detention, like somebody builds these jail cells without windows. So that's what that made me think of, like the role. And I think that is, as you beautifully just said, Rachel, like this idea that we think about, these major projects and we don't think about just daily what we're doing. In the Caribbean, where my mother's from, they had all kinds of building for the climate and they understood how to use the materials and how to use airflow. And now, of course, you go to the Caribbean and everyone's using like the same materials as here and has to air condition the shit out of everything, whereas we had an ancestral knowledge of how to build in that climate in ways that use the naturally usage shade. So you go to Jamaica and like people are living in concrete when it's the tropics and it grows everywhere and you can use natural shade in your house instead of. So those points I think are really important. I don't have a broader answer, but I think that it ties to our personal consumption, but not in that way of like everybody just recycle and then corporations can pollute the harbor way, but in the way of thinking about how much, even against our will, choice, or thinking, so much is given to us that becomes natural, that is part of these systems of oppression that we don't even know how to think our way into, so that you can be an architect for like 17 years and not think about materials until it, comes to mind. So I actually think it was a really interesting point. I don't have a better answer. Jaggy's nodding, so maybe he has a good answer too. Okay.
Yeah, I think we need to move on to the final segment of the webinar. I think most of us would agree that it's important to understand the connections between militarism and climate change, but it's equally important to understand what to do about it. What can be done? What can we do as individuals or as a group to actually forestall this disaster in progress, as we've called it? So we've asked our panelists to think in advance about just one action that they would propose or recommend to us talking for about 2 minutes. I don't know if Clayton has had his injection yet and will be able to actually give us his suggestion, but let's follow the order of presentations. That's Clayton. Clayton, are you there still? Well,
I don't see Clayton, so we could wait and do him later.
So we can then let's go to Cassia. What would you recommend?
All right. So I think a theme that we touched on a lot tonight is intersectionality, and learning about the intersectionality of the issues. We all have a responsibility to kind of do our own research and be curious. And I think that kind of going back to the question that we had earlier about, why aren't climate activists and peace activists coming together more often? I think a lot of us are being peace and climate activists in our own ways without even realizing it. There are people in the climate space who are peace activists without even realizing it. There are people who are in peace who are climate activists without even knowing. So I think learning and being curious and asking questions and not being afraid not to know everything is a big recommendation I have for young people if they're interested in getting involved in the intersection between peace and climate justice. And I think also, getting out of our silos and talking to people who are in our circles, hosting Zoom dinner conversations about these critical issues that we're faced with, and having conversations, not being afraid to, confront or speak with people who might not necessarily know everything about the issue, or who might have a different background, who may disagree. I think it's important to get out of our own bubbles. And I think for young people, joining community groups related to peace and climate action so that you can learn about global actions and localized actions that you can get involved with, those are 3 kind of accessible ways to get started. So yeah, those are my top 3.
Thank you very much, Cassia. Let's now move on to Jackie.
It's a straightforward question, but it's hard for me to answer, honestly. I'll answer in 2 ways. One is for people in the Canadian state and folks for whom what I'm about to say might resonate. And it just it goes back to something I said at the beginning of my talk, which is, I think us understanding the foundation, how foundational it is to be in active complicity with Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, and resistance. And by doing so, we learn a lot about what struggle, strategy, and resistance is. It's not an answer, right? It's actually entering into a process. And so for those of us in the Canadian state, knowing whose lands we're on, who are the people who are the custodians of that land, the cultural heritage, much of that you can do on your own, as they say, Google it, but a lot of that is establishing relationships. This is something I'm talking about, which is a process that's a lifetime, really. For many of us, it's also about exploring our previous generations and what that means, and reckoning with the past history and being honest with that, which many people are reckoning with. And by doing so, I think we'll reframe a lot of what it means to link up climate change and militarism in a way that will make both of those movements and the movement in general for social justice stronger. So that's one prong. And the second prong is understanding that this is an international audience, but this applies to everybody. Again, the importance of internationalism, because one thing that the rise of the far right has done is to sort of close us down. And I'm a firm believer in both the local and the international. There's no trade-off there at all. And when I talk about internationalism, I'm just not talking about Western Europe and North America and Canada and Australia, New Zealand. I'm talking about true internationalism in the spirit of left internationalism of the past, a third world internationalism where when I say we, those of us in the global north are not a majority voice. We are one amongst a majority world of Africans and Latin Americans and people from all over Asia, and trying to find ways in which we can connect those issues. That changes, again, the framework. So for me, it's entering into both those processes. It isn't easy. And again, it was a straightforward question, but I can't give an easy response to that. But I can only talk about entering into processes. And those are 2 that I think are essential. And they have been done, to be fair, but we need to reinforce those 2 strategies.
Jackie, thank you. And I quite understand what you're saying. I mean, I wouldn't like to answer this question myself, so it's easy for me to ask you people what your answer is. So let's now go on to Elle and see what she has to offer us.
Yeah, I think, abolition is something that we work towards in this moment, right? And abolition isn't just getting rid of police and prisons, that's an element of it. Abolition, as Mariam Kaba, it means that everything must change. It's rethinking our relationship to capitalism in particular. Understanding, for example, that Black people's root in the Americas begins as property, right? So there's a fundamental relationship between capitalism, racism, and slavery expressed by Eric Williams, for example. So as Jagi said, for example, how can we begin to have these conversations without talking about the fundamental fact that we are on stolen land? And as the signs often say at protests, no justice on stolen land, but what does that require us to take up? If you're an environmentalist, you have to be a prison abolitionist. Prisons and the environmental crisis are connected, both from where prisons are built in small towns that have lost their industries, in the fact that prison itself is an environmental disaster, the conditions that exist in a prison that are anti-nature, anti-land, of course, the incarceration of Indigenous and Black people, people from poor communities, this is all tied together. So as abolitionists, people often, think that that's a sort of imaginary fantasy about a world that can never come to be, when in fact it's about a reality of the world that we know that is sick, that we're living in now, that COVID, if we didn't know before, showed us, unequivocally how sick this society is, and how the wealth gap and the lack of care for our seniors and, a complete abandonment of each other has resulted in now a health crisis that reflects the other pandemics that we live with, the pandemics of racism, of poverty, of, not caring for each other. So abolition is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You can't just say, well, the solution is abolition, but it's an orientation to the world. As Jackie said, it's a process. It's not about a simple solution. It's about rethinking what safety means, rethinking what healing means, rethinking our orientation to our neighborhoods and lives and ourselves, and challenging the will to punishment and vengeance and hatred and disposability that lives in all of us. As people call it, the cop in our heart and the cop in our head, and challenging that. And that is fundamentally an anti-war, fundamentally a peaceful orientation, fundamentally about land and environment and food security, and all those things are into it. So I guess then I would just say, organize and fight punishment. I agree with everything said, organize where you are. The tool, that neoliberalism wants us to believe that there's no cracks, that we will constantly be surveyed, they're in your phone, you can't get away, so don't even try. And we know that there's cracks in the system. We know that we can fight and win, but we have to be organized to do it, and organizing on every level, whether that's fighting evictions in our communities, whether that's organizing to get war on the debate topics that we never even talk about when we have an election, like what party even talks about this, we don't have public conversations. So whatever way, we just have to organize. And I'll shut up. I know a Palestinian brother wanted to say something. I don't know if I know you didn't want to put it in the chat, brother, but I feel bad that you didn't get to say what you wanted to say. And I know we're out of time, but so I saw you in the chat. So shout out to the Palestinian brother that was speaking.
Well, is Clayton here? Clayton's not back? Okay. Well, we've gone past our time, and the numbers are rapidly falling as we go past our time. So thank you very much, Elle, for your comment. And the clear implication of our discussions tonight is that there's a need for solidarity between peace and climate activists, a common program. It's always easy to say these things. Of course, it's very hard in practice to actually bring it about. But we all, in our own way, need to be doing that. It's a fundamental fact that business as usual is not solving the problem. The politics as usual is not solving the problem of the climate crisis and its connection with militarism. It isn't the matter that individual choices about living environmentally friendly way will be enough. None of that will be enough. So when you have a situation in which both the market and the state have basically failed to deal with the immensity of the problem we face, we come back to civil society, the third actor. There are only three real actors: the state, the market, and society or community. So what we obviously need in this context, in this decisive decade in human history, is civil society. We can only depend on ourselves and our, organizing ourselves to deal with the major issues we face. With that thought, I'd like to, on behalf of Rachel, Greta, and myself, thank you all for attending. And I hope we'll meet again before long to discuss further these very important topics. So thank you, panel, very much for your wisdom. And thank you all for attending, and good night.
Science for Peace has provided some closing music and a final slide, so we'll leave the chat open for the last few minutes so we don't just cut off the amazing conversation that's happening there. We'll have about 3 minutes, and then we'll close it all off.